again everyone, Jessica with From Dream to Seed, and today I have a video for you beginning gardeners or any of you just looking to improve your veggie growing skills. I'm going to be giving you my best tips on how to grow peas, carrots, and onions. Peas, carrots, and onions are all considered cool weather crops, which means you can plant them into your garden before your last frost date. So for example, my last frost date is usually around Mother's Day weekend, second weekend of May. But I usually plant my peas, carrots, and onions usually by the 1st of April into the first or second week of April. This year was a little bit later because we had an unseasonably cold spring. First, let's talk about peas. I love planting peas. They're definitely one of my favorite plants to grow. They germinate and grow quickly. They're relatively low maintenance as far as their fertilization needs. They don't tend to get a lot of diseases, at least not in my area, or really even pests. My children love to come out and pick fresh peas from the garden and eat them right off the vine. They're delicious. But there are a few tips that I have to successfully grow peas. The first thing you're gonna need is some sort of trellis or something for the peas to climb, because they are a climbing plant. And they'll send out these little tendrils. You can see some old kind of dry ones here left from last year that will reach out and grab onto the netting or string or trellis or whatever you're using, and they will climb up. So you will need to construct something for the peas to climb. What I do, and what's easiest for me, is I get plastic chicken netting and I drive in T-posts, and then I just zip tie it to the T-posts. I think metal chicken wire would work a little bit better, but I'll be honest, you know how everyone has one of those, like something they hate to touch? It's like a texture thing. That's what chicken wire is for me. Maybe that's weird. It's pokey and it's hard to cut, and I avoid working with it at all costs. So I choose the plastic, but be better than me and maybe use a metal. It's pre-cut, so it's easy for me just to wind it or unwind it the length of my bed and attach it to these T-posts. Also, don't be lazy like me and buy the wrong height of chicken netting and then be too lazy to take it back to the store. So in best practices, your netting should go or trellis should go all the way to the ground. But I went ahead and had it be higher rather than taking it all the way to the ground and having it be lower, because the peas will definitely reach this height. So it's not such a big deal. By the time the peas send out tendrils, they'll be tall enough to reach this. But yeah, don't be lazy like me. My next tip is just making sure that you have good soil in whatever you're growing the peas in. So I always make sure that I amend all of my beds with a lot of compost. Peas have really shallow roots, so you don't necessarily need to amend very far down, but I do make sure that I have lots of compost, at least in the top few inches of my soil, for those peas to grow. Secondly is spacing. Some pea varieties, this is a garden sweet variety, they can be spaced a little bit closer together, so 2 or so inches apart. I usually plant at least 2 seeds in each hole to make sure I get good germination, but I will go back and thin. Other peas, like these sugar snap peas, will bush out a little more than other varieties, so you usually space those 4 to maybe even 6 inches apart. I usually amend my bed with an all-purpose fertilizer before I plant, and honestly, that's usually enough for the whole growing season for them. Also, because they're a shallow-rooted plant, you'll need to water them a little bit more than you would other plants, like tomatoes that have a lot deeper of a root system. Peas can either be directly sown in your garden or started indoors. I've done both, and both have worked great. And there's definitely pros and cons to both. The pros for starting indoors are I sometimes will get a little bit better germination because it's a much more controlled environment. And I also get a boost on a jump really on my growing season. The downside is because they grow so quickly, you have to really stay on top of that growing schedule. So if for some reason you get delayed in planting the seeds outdoors, they can get really big really fast, and it can get tangled and damaged when you try to transplant them. So I have moved to planting the majority of my peas direct sown in my garden because they germinate and grow quickly. However, this year I kind of wish I hadn't. We have definitely had a very, very unseasonably cold spring, so they are growing very slowly. So I kind of wish that I had started them indoors this year, but that's okay. They'll do fine. Fun fact about peas, did you know peas are what we call a nitrogen fixing plant? This means that the pea roots have a symbiotic relationship with beneficial bacteria in the soil, and they actually work to improve the nitrogen stores in the soil. So peas are a great plant to plant in an area that previously had a heavy feeder, say potatoes or onions. And by planting peas And if they were healthy, you can actually clip the peas off at the base when they're finished and leave those roots in the soil, and they will actually help to give your soil a nitrogen boost. Next, let's talk about onions. So here is my onion patch. It doesn't look like much now, but in a few months, this will be full of big green onion tops and hopefully big onion bulbs below. So onions can definitely be seeded directly into your garden. However, I like to start my onions from seed because they take a little bit longer to get going, especially in my area. So first, you want to make sure that you're planting the right kind of onions for your area. If you live south, then you want to plant what's called short day onions. And this means that your daylight hours in the summertime are shorter than they would be for those up north because of the tilt of the earth in the northern hemisphere. So you want to make sure that you're choosing short day onions, and this means they're onions that will be signaled to start bulbing when the daylight hours are usually between 9 to 10 hours long. If you try to grow long day onions and you're in a short day onion zone, then you may not get as big of bulbs as you would if you had planted the correct kind of onions. If you live up north, then you can plant long day onions because your daylight hours are much longer, 12 to 14 hours. If you're like me and you're kind of in between, I live in the southern part of Indiana, then you can plant intermediate day onions. I'm also kind of on that edge where I can plant long day onions, which is honestly what I plant, and they do just fine. So first, make sure you are choosing the right type of onion bulb or seed to plant in your garden. My next tip is, if you decide to purchase onion seedlings from a store rather than starting from seed, you want to make sure that you're buying onion starts and not onion sets. Onion starts will look exactly like this. They will have green tops to them, and they are basically onions that have been started in a seed cell, grown to 6 to 8 inches tall, harvested, and then are sold to you. And this is important because these are first year onions. Onions are biennial plants, which means they will flower and seed in the second year that they are planted. If you buy onion sets, which look like little tiny onion bulbs, then those are actually second year onions. That means somebody has planted onions, they have let them start to bulb and then harvested them prematurely. They have been stored for a while and then sold to you. So when you plant those into your garden, that bulb thinks it's the second year for it to grow. So it will put more energy into flowering and producing seed than it will into making a bigger bulb, which is what you want. So make sure you're buying onion starts with green tops and not onion sets. Before I plant my onion seedlings, there's always a few things that I always do to help me have more successful onion harvest. I always make sure that my beds are amended with a lot of compost because onions, or at least the part that we normally eat, are growing below the ground. You want to make sure that you have nice loose soil that they can not only bulb but also expand into. I also make sure that I am in my soil with an all-purpose organic fertilizer. I use all-purpose at first. This will help the onions to develop strong roots. After they develop for a while, I will go heavy with the nitrogen. I use blood meal because the nitrogen helps the leaves grow, and the more leaves you have on top, the bigger bulbs you have underneath. I also make sure that I water my bed before I plant my onion seedlings. My onion seedlings are usually pretty small when I plant them, and I don't want to plant them and then water and possibly displace those small onion seedlings. I heavily sow my onions in my seed cells, so they never quite get really big before I plant them in the garden. They'll get about 6 to 8 inches tall, but they're still pretty thin as far as their leaf size, and that's okay. They do just fine. And they may look a little sad and kind of floppy when you first put them in, but like this one, you can see it's perking up pretty quickly. Now, I plant varieties that get pretty big bulbs. I have some Alice Craig, I have some Cortland, and I also have, some Bridgers, and these are storage onions, which I like to plant because then they store well. And the bulbs will get pretty big on these, and so I make sure that I plant my onions about 4 to 6 inches apart. You can definitely go more with less space in between if you're just wanting to harvest onions for the tops, maybe for spring onions, or if you have a smaller bulbing variety. As far as watering and fertilizing goes, like I said, I will go with an all-purpose fertilizer at first and then pretty heavy on the nitrogen. And because onions are heavy feeders, I'm going in with that nitrogen once the plants really start to take off, probably about every 2 weeks. Watering, I just make sure, because it's a bulbing vegetable, it's underneath the ground, but I also don't want the onion to rot with the soil being too wet. So I usually tend to go more with deep and frequent waterings with my onions than I would for something like my peas that has a much shallower root. And last but not least, this is my carrot patch with one lone flowering kale behind me that I'm going to be saving seed on. I feel like carrots can definitely be one of the trickier plants for almost any gardener, but especially beginning gardeners, to grow. And that's mainly for two reasons. One is they can be tricky to germinate, and number two, they can be tricky to grow if you're growing in ground that isn't loose or amended well, at least 12 inches down. This is one of the reasons that I choose to grow carrots in raised beds, because I have beds that are at least 12 inches high and amended with a lot of compost, so I have nice loose soil for these carrots to grow in. If I tried to grow carrots in ground in my area and just stuck them in my yard, I have such heavy clay soil that those carrots would probably not even germinate to begin with, but if they did, they would be very stunted and would probably split because of all the heavy compacted soil that's in the ground. So if you are choosing to grow carrots in ground, you just want to make sure that at least the top 12 inches of your soil is amended with a lot of organic matter. Compost is a great thing to add, so that you're providing a nice loose soil for these carrots to grow. My first tip is for germination. Carrot seeds are so small. They are usually planted no more than about 1/8, maybe a 1/4 of an inch deep. So I always make sure that first I pre-moisten the soil, and I do this so that I don't have to water afterwards, because if I go in with a watering can or a nozzle sprayer after I plant the carrot seeds, I can easily wash away those seeds, or perhaps kind of with the water pound them down into the earth, into the soil too deep, and then they won't be able to germinate. My second tip for germination is, if you have a growing medium or soil that tends to form kind of a hard crust on the top when it dries, you might want to consider covering the carrots with not the soil you're planting in, but either a compost or actually even vermiculite. And this will keep the carrots covered enough so that they can germinate, but it won't allow that hard crust to form, which these tiny thin seedlings can't then push up through. So like I said, I'm in my beds with plenty of compost, so that's airy enough and loose enough for those carrots to push up through. But you may want to consider topping with compost or even vermiculite if you have soil that gets hard on top. My next tip for germination is, carrots, like all seeds, if they dry out when they are germinating, they will die. So you have to make sure that the soil or the growing medium you're growing carrots in stays wet. However, because they're planted so shallow and the top few inches of that soil is what's going to dry out fastest, it can be difficult to stay on top of making sure that that soil is wet enough for those carrots to germinate. So you may have seen where a lot of people will cover their carrot seeds with cardboard or maybe even really thin plywood. And this serves several purposes. Number one, it keeps the soil from drying out too quickly. And number two, it can also protect the seedlings from the seeds from heavy rainfall or anything that might displace those seeds. The downside to this is you have to definitely go out and check underneath the cardboard or the plywood every day to make sure that you have, to see if you have germination, and that has to come off so you don't kill your seedlings because they don't have any sunlight. The downside to this is you have to make sure that you're checking underneath that cardboard or that plywood daily to see if you have germination, because as soon as you have germination, you want that to come off so that the seeds can then get sunlight. So what I have found that works really well in my garden is I actually cover my carrot seedlings with burlap. And this works really well for a couple of reasons. It still serves the purpose of helping to keep that soil more moist and also will displace heavy rainfall. But if for some reason the carrots germinate and I didn't get out to check them that day, because burlap has these small holes in it, the carrot seedlings can actually grow up through this burlap, which is totally fine. And then when I need to remove the burlap, I can just simply pull it away and the carrot seeds will stay in the ground and this comes off. And I just water right over top of this burlap every few days. Now, I will say I can only do this in the spring because of the temperatures in my area. I do a second crop of carrots in the fall. We have very long and hot fall temperatures. So for my carrot crop in the fall, I will have to cover them with something like cardboard is what I usually use, because this will not keep the soil cool enough for germination. It will also not keep the soil moist enough for germination. So if you live in an area that has milder temperatures or you're only growing in the spring, try burlap. I just hold it down with landscaping staples. It works really, really well for germination of carrots. When it comes to actually planting the seed, I usually will dig a trench about 1/4 of an inch deep. Because I'm planting in so much compost, I can get away with planting a little bit deeper, but 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch if you have pretty loose soil. Now I heavily seed my carrots because the germination can be kind of spotty. You can see here, I have a section here that didn't do so well. I have a few coming up and a section here that did great. I will obviously go and thin the carrots once they start getting true leaves, and this is so I can get much bigger carrots. If I don't thin them, then all of these tap roots underneath would be competing for space, and I would have little carrots, and I want big carrots. So I will definitely be thinning these once I see some true leaves. Quick side note, carrots are traditionally always started from seed in the garden and not transplanted. Carrot seeds, because they have that long taproot, which is the part you're eventually going to eat, they do not transplant well at all. So if you transplant carrots, you'll have to comment below and tell me how you do that magic. But I have always started carrots from seed in the garden and have not risked losing them to transplant. Like most of my crops in my veggie garden, before I plant my carrots, I will amend the soil with an all-purpose organic fertilizer. Carrots, like onions, are also heavy feeders. However, carrots are a root vegetable and not a bulb vegetable like onions. So onions, I will go heavy on the nitrogen once they start to really grow. This will give me more green growth on top, which will mean a bigger bulb below. Carrots, on the other hand, I go heavy on the phosphate, and I do that because if I were to add a lot of nitrogen to the soil, I'll get nice pretty green growth on top, but not very big roots, which is what I want. So once these carrots really start to take off and have probably 3, maybe 4 sets of true leaves, then I will actually start amending the soil with bone meal, which is really heavy in the phosphorus. Water your carrots pretty frequently for the first few weeks until they get 3, 4, maybe 5 sets of true leaves. Then you're going to want to switch to more deep and frequent waterings. Remember, where the water is, the roots will go. So as the top few inches of that soil dries out, the carrot roots will go deeper, searching for that water, which results in a bigger carrot. So deep and frequent watering is a much better watering method for carrots. And that's it. Those are my best tips for planting peas, carrots, and onions. Comment below and tell me what varieties you like to grow in your garden. I have my tried and trues, but I really enjoy planting new varieties, so let me know what you like to grow. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram and TikTok, where I post really short videos with tips and tricks on how to grow fruits, vegetables, and flowers. And until then, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.